So this is a question that comes up a lot. The grammar school selection test and the independent school entrance exams, they all kind of fall under this term of the 11 plus. Hi, it's Joycelyn here from Geek School Tutoring. So today I want to talk about whether children who do not pass the grammar school test have any hope at all of passing the independent, i.e. the private school entrance exams. The short answer to it is it really depends. And I know that sounds a bit flowery, but I'm going to break all of it down in this video. One thing that needs to be known is that the format of the grammar school papers is different to those of the independent or private school papers. So grammar school papers are multiple choice. So students basically have to shade in or draw a line in boxes, and there'll be a picture of what that would look like at any point in this video. Let's see where I edit it to. Anyway, so it's usually A, B, C, D or E. Sometimes there's an N there for parts of the English paper. And so they go through the whole paper and that's all they do. In some counties like Medway, they have a creative writing piece which is marked, unlike Kent, which has a creative writing piece, but it doesn't account for the marks, and it's not accounted for in the marks rather, and it's only used if there is an appeal. So generally it's just purely multiple choice. And loosely, you have two major players in terms of the style of exams, the GL papers and the SEM papers. In other parts of the country, you might come across the CSSE. Some counties use the set papers like Sutton does, but largely GL and SEM have dominated the 11 plus grammar school style papers. With the private school or independent school papers, they don't use multiple choice for their maths and English anyway. Some schools have a verbal or non-verbal reasoning paper and tend to use the multiple choice answer sheets possibly because of the supplier, where they get that paper from. And there isn't one supplier, but a lot of independent schools tend to use GL, but that isn't definitive. It's so interesting seeing schools change their providers, sort of move the goalpost a bit. It's getting very, very interesting in the 11 plus domain. So ultimately, in the independent school papers, children have to write a descriptive answer. So if it's a maths question, they're expected to show they're working out the different stages which they've used to get the answer. And for the English, there's usually a comprehension piece and a creative writing piece. Comprehension isn't multiple choice. I mean, there might be a handful of questions for some papers where usually in like the grammar style questions, so on line 15, which word is an adjective, and then they just choose A, B, C, D or E or something. But even where that's included, they are expected to write a descriptive answer. And the answers are not the same mark. So on a grammar school paper, literally you get that question right and it's 1 mark. So you get question 1 correct, question 15 correct, question 21. They're all the equivalent of 1 mark. On the independent school papers, however, every question doesn't have the same mark. It's not all 1 mark. So there are longer pieces, shorter pieces, and that is the same for maths. Big multi-step questions are not going to be 1 mark, 3 or 4, sometimes even higher, for example. why is this even relevant? Well, the relevance of that background information that I've just given you is because we're not all wired the same, you know, and some children have a real affinity towards the grammar school style papers and others just don't, you know. So you might get a child who makes avoidable mistakes on their paper, not passing or doing well enough to be offered a place for grammar school. However, they are given they are offered a place at an independent school. Does it mean that the independent school papers are easier? No, not in all cases. In most cases, not. They are very competitive, just like the grammar schools. However, a child who would have lost that whole mark on a grammar school paper, let's just say that the last stage in their working out, they put a 3 on the answer line instead of a 2. The markers can see the stages of work. So if there are marks for working out, so in other words, it's usually questions that are worth more than 1 mark, they would clock up marks along the way. So it's possible, you know, and it happens all the time, that some children just don't do well on the grammar school papers, but they get into a good independent school. And so you might think, oh, does it mean that independent schools are easier to get into? No. Independent schools also interview the children, they look at school reports, and so on. So they get what I would say is a holistic view of that child. They don't just base it on a score and a computerized way of selecting children. There's more of a human aspect to this, which is, I think, is good. So a child is able to pass the paper and be interviewed to see whether they'd be a good fit for that school, which has its pros and cons. Okay, so this is a question that comes up a lot. The grammar school selection test and the independent school entrance exams, they all kind of fall under this term of the 11 plus. And so in answer to the question, does failing or not passing well enough, however you'd like to term it, not getting into grammar school mean that a child cannot get into an independent school? I would say no. I'd say no based on the reasons that I've given. Disclaimer, independent school exams are not easier than the grammar school exams. It's just a different format, and it just depends on what the school decides to put in their paper at any given time. So, you know, just like the SEM papers where it's, you know, not the same regurgitated style every year. Not that the GL is, but those questions come from a bank of questions. So children who have been practicing the packs and papers often feel a lot more comfortable doing those than SEM, although it changes every year. Honestly, it's quite interesting working in this field, because I speak to the students after their exams to try and get as much information from them as possible. And what I hear year on year seems to be changing quite a bit. So it's interesting. But if you have a child who maybe didn't pass the Sutton grammars, or, you know, whichever grammar school exams for which you have the results for, it does not mean that they will fail the independent school papers. Neither does it mean that they're not bright enough to be offered some sort of a scholarship. It really depends. And, you know, on the day, if you haven't slept very well, or you've been up worrying, etc., being the child this is, of course it can have a huge impact on how they answer the question. So it's never really just straightforward like that. So my best suggestion is to have your child independently assessed. So ideally a word of mouth tutor who you can have some trust in, who will be able to do the type of test that you as a parent will be able to see what the questions were, you know, what did my child put on there. And you can also speak to the head teacher of their primary school to get some insight into the feasibility. So that's it, really. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions about this or anything else, as usual, you know, please do put something in the comments and I will do my best to reply. Thank you.